Thank you for tuning in to the Helium Radio Network. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
We're live here from the Miami Book Fair, the Neil Haley Show, powered by Life Improvement Radio. You visit lifeimprovementradio.com and also neilhaley.com and at Twitter at Total Tutor. Interesting, 2 hours in already. It's funny, when we first say the first hours, it got 4 more hours to go. It's going to take forever. It's never going to end. But with these great guests, it doesn't feel like time flies when you're having fun, Eric. Wouldn't you agree, Eric? Welcome back, Eric Remmel from Life Improvement Radio. I mean, the guests have just been so top-notch. They've absolutely have connected perfectly to our interests so far. It's been a fabulous eighth book fair for us.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to getting to all of our next interviews, and it's been a fun day so far. Like you said, 2 hours in, 4 to go.
Yeah, and we had another history story involvement, and it's another one that I'm going to learn a lot from. I'm excited to welcome the program Julia Flynn Siler. She's an American journalist and a nonfiction author of her latest book, The White Devil's Daughters, The Woman Who Fought Slavery in San Francisco's Chinatown. How are you today, Julia, and thanks for calling.
Well, I'm great, Neil, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
And, you know, when you talk about, let's just jump to this, people only think of slavery in the United States based on one area, right? When we talk slavery, we talk the Civil War specifically at that point in time, and most of the conversations are based on the slavery that took place in that time, right? When you agree, Julia, when you think about the U.S.
Absolutely right. And The White Devil's Daughters talks about a very different type of slavery that was prevalent on the West Coast involving Asian American girls and women.
And wow. And what time period did that take place? Is that mostly during the gold rush time period, or what would you say, what time period?
Well, the intense trafficking began with the gold rush and, of course, with the arrival of Chinese men who built much of the railroads and dug the tunnels in California after the gold rush and with the transatlantic railroad. And many of them left their families behind, and so there was a huge demand for sex. And criminal tongs, Chinese criminal gangs, swooped in and started trafficking women from China to fill that demand. And that my book starts in the 1870s and follows the journey for about seven decades, 70 years, until the 1930s.
Eric, thinking about that part of history, going into the gold rush and what was happening, we didn't think of slavery on that end, even though there was a lot of horrific things that were happening for Asian Americans coming to the U.S. at that time period, for sure.
Yeah, we don't usually, it's not something usually taught or thought about. You know, you kind of glance over the gold rush, you know, so to speak, in history and when you're learning about it as a child, things like that. But it's a really interesting spin on it. Obviously, we're, you know, some time period after that now, you know, we're hundreds of years later. What was it like doing research for the book? Did you have to go back and spend a lot of time in the San Francisco Bay Area, or what was it like doing research for the book?
I spent 5 years piecing together this story, and I worked in the National Archives. I worked at Berkeley, at Stanford. But most of my research was at a very specific house in San Francisco, which is still standing today, and was erected in the 1870s as a safe house for these trafficked Chinese girls and women. And it's now known as Cameron House in honor of one of the women who ran this safe house or this refuge for many, many years. My research was really, to me, very fascinating because the house, as I mentioned, still standing, has got the case files of 2,000 to 3,000 women who passed through its doors in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And up until now, these case files have been locked away because it's kind of a shameful history that people did not want to talk about. But the folks who ran the house came to trust that I would tell their story with a great deal of sensitivity. And so I've traced the journeys of some of the women who took refuge in the home and then what happened to them afterwards as well. And it's really been an interesting experience. And, every book event I've done since the book came out, someone has come up to me and said, my grandmother came through this house, or my auntie came through this house. So I've been meeting this wide diaspora of people who pass through this safe house.
And it's not much in the history books. That's the thing that probably frustrates you, right?
Well,
you're writing.
Now it's a story with the White Devil's Daughters. It's a story that is becoming more known. In San Francisco, for example, the woman who runs the Department on the Status of Women has been coming to a few of my events and saying, we should erect a statue for the courageous women who ran this home for all those years. And so it's becoming better known. And one thing that's so striking to me is that this safe house in San Francisco was really a pioneering institution that fought human trafficking, even though in those days that was not the word that they used to describe what they were doing. They said they were fighting the slave girl trade, which is a term we wouldn't really use today. But they were pioneers in fighting human trafficking. And now, today, people who are fighting this crime have some precedent. They have a historical story of really activists who came together and saw social injustice and tried to do something to fight it.
Wow, for sure. And I think that this also speaks to what's still happening today. This human trafficking is happening in the United States still. It's happening all over the world. So even talking about history of it taking place then, it's still happening today. Other slaveries disappeared, but this slavery really hasn't.
Arguably, it's even rising. I mean, human trafficking seems to rise as there is political turmoil and economic chaos in different countries. And the port cities in our nation, San Francisco, Miami, New York, those are the hubs for human trafficking today. And so you are absolutely right. It continues, and in some ways the dynamics are very similar to what I write about in the 19th century, where women are tricked into situations of forced prostitution and debt indebtedness in some way to their traffickers.
And we're afraid to highlight it. That's happening today. But ultimately, reading a book like this will have people start to research and say, how horrible was that time? But then they'd see, it's continuing. Now, talking about that time period, you talked about slavery of women. What about men in that time period, especially during the gold rush? Was there slavery in another way, like slavery during the Civil War times?
Well, scholars are doing more and more work in the area of the enslavement of, for example, Native American people. And there was certainly the equivalent of debt peonage of some Asian Americans during the 19th century who came to the United States. I focus specifically on women and girls who'd been trafficked and enslaved in that way. And one of the questions that might come up is, well, did they do this willingly in some way? Did they enter into prostitution, which was not illegal in the 19th century in San Francisco, as a way to help their families? And my answer to that is many of the girls who ended up being trafficked came as very, very young people. You know, they were 11, 12, 13 years old, and they would come often in very large groups of girls and women. 200, 300 would land onto the docks of San Francisco and then be auctioned off in groups. And this trade, which thrived during the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, after the 13th Amendment of the Constitution had been passed, which outlawed slavery, was helped by white officials, and those same officials profited from it.
What is your hope for your readers to get most out of your book?
Well, my hope is that it is a inspiring story of the way that a few people, a very small group of people, saw a social injustice and decided to do something about it. In this case, it was a small group of women who decided to set up a safe house. And as a result, they touched thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people's lives. And it was really a small gesture. And I think we can take away something from that today. There's certainly plenty of injustice in our world today as well. So I'm hoping people feel inspired by this story.
Exactly. Eric, any other thoughts?
Well, I was just curious. It sounds like this book was so impactful. Any idea of any future works? Do you want to continue this subject matter or kind of do something else during the same time period?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I'm really fascinated by the overall subject of women and power. And The White Devil's Daughter is a book about women helping other women, and these were progressive era women for the most part. You know, they were doing this at a time before they had the vote, before they had any significant political or financial power, but they found a way to exert power. And so my next book will probably explore some of the same subjects, and I'm particularly interested in the power of higher education and how the universities opened up to women and why they were opened up to women.
Quite an interesting topic. Definitely will want to talk about that. Well, my education background as a former teacher and own a tutoring consulting company, education is something that the crack, especially in the higher education realm, where we've seen it. And now it's turned around and women are dominating academia and men are not attending as much anymore. And I wouldn't say that's horrible, but how can we have a balance at one point again?
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree?
Very good question. I do agree. We've seen incredible shift in the higher education landscape. So, no, that's a very good point.
And it goes back to our K through 12 teaching, how we're teaching boys, and how we kind of made it teach to girls because it wasn't being taught to girls. And then we don't look at this happy medium, individualized instruction for everybody. Then we wouldn't have these problems, like these shifts academically and different things. And it also goes back to home life, how maybe girls are able to overcome more adversity than boys without a father figure. I don't know. I'm bringing up certain things to think about why we're seeing this education landscape change.
Well,
any thought on your end on that?
I particularly spent the last 5 years focusing on a world, a 19th, early 20th century world in which education was highly segregated by race, and Chinese students were not permitted to attend the same schools as white students for many, many years, and likewise, girls' educations were put second to boys' educations. But you make an excellent point about how far we've come from that time, and one example of that would be the lawsuit at Harvard right now by Asian students, which is really a fascinating court case to follow.
The value of education we're missing in this country. I keep saying this, and I also believe that in the standpoint where you're focusing kids on making it, especially the more wealthy, making it in sports compared to other things instead of academics, it opens up the field completely for the international student that comes to this country. And I wish that more and more families will see the value of education. But this is going to be a fascinating book, to say the least. Where's the best place we can find information on you? Purchase your book and learn more about it. Where's that place?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I have a website. It's www.juliaflynnsiler.com, or you could just Google the name of the book, The White Devil's Daughters. I'm on Twitter, J.F. Siler, author. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. So you come check me out.
Well, thanks for calling. I appreciate you coming on the show, and best of luck.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You're listening to Neil Haley Show, powered by Life Improvement Radio, live from the Mind Book Fair. And we'll be back in just a moment.
Thank you for listening to Helium Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and should not be construed in any way as advice from Helium Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by producers, writers, and editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the express written consent of Helium Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.